Hi there, this is Prague Talk, a podcast from Radio Prague International. My name is Ian Willoughby. My guest this time out is Englishman Colin Stuart. Colin has been a fixture on the Prague music scene since the early 1990s, when he produced the Ecstasy of St. Theresa and several other local bands. He also worked with musicians from those groups on Colorfactory, a musical project that he'd brought with him from the US, and that reached large audiences when the music was used in the era-defining film Šeptej, or Whisper. I've been a big fan of the first Colorfactory LP from that time, and it was a great pleasure to speak to Colin Stuart at his studio just around the corner from Prague's Dancing Building for this edition of Prague Talk. So my first question, Colin, how did you first get started in producing and engineering music?
I had a band when I was like 18 years old. We wrote our own songs, we started recording in studios, and the results were always absolutely terrible. First we tried an 8-track studio, then a 16-track, saved up money from playing concerts, and the results were so terrible, it was a complete waste of money. We couldn't really afford to go into professional 24-track studios. So I said, okay, sod it, I'll learn how to do it myself. So I got a couple of microphones, a cassette recorder, and just started with my band in our garage where we rehearsed. Soon moved on to recording on reel-to-reel tape recorders, then onto a 4-track cassette player, the first Porter Studio, one of the first that came into England I bought and started. I made a punk Oi Oi version of Mull of Kintyre by Paul McCartney, just for a joke as a sound check when I was recording the punk band The Members, and somebody heard that and said, oh, I hated that song, I want to release this. And strangely enough, it ended up being released and played on Radio 1, so national radio. I had recorded on cassette. That was my first single. Then I did a favour for one of my friends, the drummer that was playing with us. He came and asked me to help him fix a car. He'd broken his sister's car. I was able to fix it very easily because I've always been handy with tools. He offered to pay me, and I said, hey, buy me a beer. You know, I don't charge my friends for such a small job. And he told his dad about this, which was very strange because his dad was Paul McCartney's business manager. And he's a bit like a mafia guy. He said, oh, he's done us a favour. We owe him. And what does he need? And my friend said, oh, he needs a job. And this manager guy says, well, what does he do? And my friend said, oh, he's a sound engineer. So a week goes by, I know nothing about this conversation, and out of the blue I get an invitation to go to Abbey Road Studios. I get a tour of Abbey Road Studios, and then the boss says, well, you're not, on the professional level of the engineers we're looking for, doing 24-track recordings, but because you're a technician as well as an engineer, you should get a job on a mobile studio. We'll ask around and see about that. I go home, and a week later I get an invitation from a mobile studio, which turns out to be the Rolling Stones Mobile.
That's what they recorded on in the south of France at the chateaus and stuff.
It's the mobile studio that is actually mentioned in Smoke on the Water. They sing to make records with the mobile, and that mobile studio was bought by a company in London, and I went up to see the boss, and he said, hey, you're perfect, you're what we're looking for, a technician and engineer. Can you start today? So that threw me into the world of absolutely the top of the music business. I went from garages with unknown punk bands. One of the first gigs I did was recording Bob Dylan. That was at Slane Castle in Dublin. My job was to sit on the stage and fix anything if it went wrong. And of course, with professional equipment, almost never anything went wrong. So I got to sit and watch Bob Dylan, B.B. King, Paco de Lucia, Ultravox, any band you can name.
But you also had, I was reading, a connection with Steve Lillywhite, who was a famous producer in those days, doing U2 and God knows who else, lots of big acts. Yeah,
well, after a couple of years on this mobile studio, the boss saw me playing a guitar on stage in Madrid, and he said, oh, I've realised you want to be a musician and not an engineer. He said, you're not really interested in engineering. I said, well, yeah, I can't make any money out of being a musician, so I'm quite happy being an engineer. And he said, well, yeah, but I want people who are interested in engineering and want to be the best engineer possible. So he said, you should be a musician or a producer because you're interested in music and not engineering. So basically he fired me. And for a few months I started going around. I was recording a few other bands. I started working with the individual members of Kajagoogoo, who had had a massive hit and then split up. So I made demos and some records with them. And then I started making a song with my old friend who was Steve Lillywhite's brother, Adrian. Adrian recently passed away, and he was the drummer in my first band. He came to me and said, I want to make a song with my wife, very attractive singer. And so I wrote a song for her, and we recorded it, and we were mixing it in Steve Lillywhite's studio. I hadn't seen Steve Lillywhite since I was at school. He was in my brother's class, I think. But I knew him like vaguely and knew him to talk to. And I was working in his studio mixing this song with his brother, and he came back from America a day or two early and surprised us. I thought he'd be upset, but he was fine with us using the studio. He said, oh, well, you know how this mixing desk works? And I said, yeah, roughly. I said he had a big, beautiful AMEC mixing console, but I knew mostly how it worked. And I finished mixing this single for his brother, and he said, hey, I've got to do some remixes of Talking Heads. Can you help me out? I said, well, twist my arm. I absolutely love Talking Heads. So I started working on Talking Heads with him. After a couple of days, his wife, he was married to the singer Kirsty MacColl, who sang on the Christmas hit Fairy Tale of New York with the Pogues. She came into the studio. I'd only ever said hello to her a couple of times at her front door. I didn't know her at all. She came in and said, hey, I've written a song. And she had writer's block for a couple of years. She'd had kids and couldn't really get herself back into writing songs. And she'd written a song. She said, hey, Colin, you can play guitar, can't you? And thrust a beautiful old Gibson guitar into my hand. And in 10 minutes, we'd recorded a song called 15 Minutes. So then I started working with her, with Kirsty MacColl. When her husband was away, I was producing stuff and engineering stuff with her. And when her husband was there, I was his engineer and assistant. And I spent a year and a half working in their home studio. Had some great times there. A couple of times I went there to record Johnny Marr. He was a good friend of Kirsty's. A couple of times he turned up and she was still in bed. So he said, oh, let's go in the studio and jam. And I'm like, am I dreaming or what? You know, Johnny Marr's asking me to jam with him in the studio. So he played my Guild guitar and he said, oh, can I buy this off you? And I said, no. I said, I wouldn't sell it for any money. And he said, well, I wouldn't if I owned this guitar. He said, it's a very nice one. But he played my guitar. I got to play his guitars, and I learnt quite a few things from watching him just jamming around and exploring ideas. And then, of course, once Kirsty woke up, she'd come into the studio with coffee and we'd all start working for the day.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I've got to get to Prague. And what brought you to Prague? And when did you come?
I did like an album and a half with Kirsty. And then I got a phone call from a guy. I can't say he was a friend, but he was a musician I knew. And he called me from California and said, I'm in this band and they've got some recording equipment, but they don't know how to use it. Will you come over and record some demos for us? They offered to pay me. So I said, okay, yeah, I'll come. I had nothing else to do. So I go to California. It turns out this band are called the Colorfactory. The main guy had written some nice songs, Michael, and I tried recording them, but they were really untogether. They only played one gig. They were way more into drugs than music, so nothing really happened. But I did my best and recorded 8 or 10 songs. And then they threw me out of their flat, which was pretty strange because they didn't pay me. They were supposed to be paying me for this work. And they said, oh, if you can't pay the rent, you have to move out. Fortunately, one of their friends thought this was very bad treatment of me from them. So she took me in. And a short time later, I left and came back to England. She came to England to visit me, and then she came to Prague. Cut a long story short, she invited me to Prague. I came here for Christmas 92, I think it was, Christmas 91 or 92, with my guitar and a suitcase, and I thought I'll be here for a couple of weeks to see what it's like in Prague. My American girlfriend had told me they'd had a revolution here, and there was an amazing atmosphere around concerts, and general enthusiasm for music was off the scale. when I arrived here, I found that to be absolutely true. And the first person I spoke to, first Czech guy I spoke to, was Jan Mukov.
From the group The Ecstasy of St. Theresa, who were the best-known Czech shoegaze band. This year, there was a book about Czech shoegaze, and the author of the book called you the shadow architect of the Czech shoegaze scene. What was your involvement with that world? And I guess you produced pretty much everybody on the scene.
Yeah, well, when I met Jan Mukov, I was just told he was my American girlfriend's sister, said to me, "Oh, that guy's got the best band in Prague." We were sitting in the Bunker Club, and she said, "Oh, I really fancy him," or something. So I said, "Well, I'm not so interested in how he looks, but if he's got the best band in Prague, I better go and speak to him." So I walk over and said, "How are you doing?" And he said, "Oh, we're just making our first album. We've made an EP and we're making an album." And I said, "That's what I do. I make albums." And he said, "Oh, well, will you help us?" So straight away, I'd been here like 2 or 3 days, I think, and I had a job. I spent a month making the Susurrate, which is one of the strangest sounding albums you'll ever hear. Lots of people said it sounds like you've got fluff on your needle when you play the record, when you haven't. I went to the shop to try and buy a copy when it was first released, and the woman in the shop didn't want to sell it to me. She said, "Oh, we have to send these back. They're not pressed properly." And I said, "Well, can I listen to it?" And I listened to it, and I said, "No, it's supposed to sound like that." She's like, "Well, it can't be. There's almost no high frequencies." And I said, "Well, that's how the band wanted it to sound, so that's how I made it sound for them. It's not my sound, it's their sound. But I did what they asked me. That's the job of a producer." Then I went on to record the Sebastians. I recorded Troyen. I recorded Here. I think I did Naked Souls. A few other smaller bands. And at one point somebody called me the godfather of independent guitar music, post-communist something. But basically I just did my thing and recorded bands as best I could. And then the Colorfactory project came up, which was the songs I'd recorded in California. The guys I'd been recording, especially the Sebastians and Ecstasy, they heard these tapes from California and got a project together to record in Rudolfinum.
So those songs on the first album, Colorfactory, they existed from your time in California, and they were simply recorded here by these Czech guys with the Czech vocalist David Volanec.
Yeah. And we recorded in the Rudolfinum, which was like the first ever pop record, I think, recorded and mixed in the Rudolfinum. I'd mixed the Sebastian's record in the Rudolfinum because it was the only studio in Czech Republic that had an SSL mixing desk. That was the kind of standard I'd been used to in London studios. So I was very happy to work there. But of course, the old communist structure was still in place, so it was very difficult to arrange and do business with these people. You couldn't book the studio for a day or for a week or for however long. You had to pay for every 4-hour session. There was no discounts for being in there for a longer time. So we recorded there at night because it was cheaper. We had everybody on the stage in the Rudolfinum. We quickly realized we couldn't use the bass in a huge hall like that, so we had the bass in headphones. And this is back in 93 or 94, and they had cordless headphones. And I was amazed. I'd never seen this technology. Then we realized the singer, David, also was kind of blowing out the acoustic in the room every time he hit a higher note. So we had the bass player sitting on stage with us, but only playing into headphones. We had 4 guitarists, I think, which was Jan Mukov from Ecstasy, Ivo Heger from Troyen, Dusan Lippert from the Sebastians, and later from Ohm Square, and me. My Czech wife, by that time I was already married, I think, and my Czech wife, Eva, played Fender piano. And we did the recording in 2 nights, and we then spent 8 months using downtime or any free time or cheap time we could get mixing, and we added Miloš Vacík on percussion and on flute Jiří Stivin, a couple of other guests. And just as we were finishing mixing, David Ondříček came in and said, "Hey, can I use this music in my new film?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure, that's no problem for me." And I just went back to mixing, and basically I didn't know him, so I didn't pay too much attention. Then Šeptej came out And instead of most of the records I'd made sold 2,000 or 3,000 copies in Prague. That was pretty average for the underground scene here. But the Colorfactory took off because of the film, and we sold like 25,000 albums.
For me, that is the album of the 90s in Prague, and I've still played very often. I presume you must get a lot of people like of my generation who approach you or tell you what that album means to them, even all these years later.
Yeah, we played a few gigs with Colorfactory, and for a while it was okay. Then the tensions in the band, it was quite hard to play with 7, 8 or 9 people, and it was very soft music, so it was very hard to get the sound right. We had to play in theatres mostly. We played a few festivals, but we couldn't play in clubs because of if anyone was talking or making a noise while we were playing, we couldn't make the atmosphere. The atmosphere is the most important thing on that record. And there's no, great musical playing or anything. We just did very mellow, slowed down versions of Michael's songs from California. And after the band split up, I got into doing live sound for bands. I traveled around with lots of different bands through my years in Czech Republic. And literally every town I've been to, almost every time I go to a gig, there's a few people come up to me and say how much they love the film Šeptej and how much they love Colorfactory and what it meant to them. And they've always been asking me about a reunion. And I always tell them, well, I'm totally up for doing a reunion, but unfortunately I can't sing those songs. David has a higher voice than me. I tried for a while. I stopped drinking and smoking. I tried to focus on practicing a lot, but my voice just wasn't the right voice to sing those songs. So eventually we gave up and the band fell apart. Several times over the years, I've tried to get people interested. Of course, there's lots of fans interested in a reunion, but David was never really interested. He lost his taste for performing live. And, some people love to be on a stage. Some people get, nervous or frightened or just don't feel comfortable on a stage. Anyway, and that brings us up to date when I had a phone call from Jan Mukov a couple of months ago, and he said Šeptej is having their 30th anniversary showing at Karlovy Film Festival.
Next year.
This year coming, yes. And he said after the showing of Šeptej, they've asked the original Colorfactory to reform and play a gig. And I said, well, if everybody else is up for it, of course I'm up for it. I've been waiting 20 years for this. And Honza Mukov said, yeah, I've already asked everyone that everybody else is in. So it's already in the planning stages. And I've just had my Fender Rhodes piano. That came from Abbey Road Studios. That was also through my friend's dad. I ended up with that. I've just had that serviced and tuned up ready for the concert.
So you're ready to go?
Yeah, we're all ready to go. I've got my acoustic guitar. I'm working on new microphones and pickups for that because I'd like to get a really nice, good sound when we start playing again. And I'm really looking forward to it.
My final question, Colin. I presume you're glad that you washed up here in Prague all those years ago?
Yeah, I'm extremely glad. Even though the Czech language is a very hard language to learn for a lot of foreigners, very hard to pronounce, I've slowly picked up. My understanding of Czech is now quite good, even though I still speak like a 5-year-old and make lots of grammatical errors. I don't think my friends mind too much. But the mindset of Czech people is much more in tune with my vibe than the average English people, to be honest. I got really sick of the violence in England. When I was young, I was like a teenager. I was a hippie. And I was constantly being chased around by skinheads. People were fighting in bars every weekend. It was really just not a good place for me. And as soon as I came to Prague, I was like, wow, these people are peaceful. They don't get into fights. If they have an argument, they shout a bit and then they sit down and say, okay, let's have a beer. And I really appreciate that. And I love the Czech vibe. I've been really happy here. I've got 2 kids that are now grown up. They're both massive fans of Colorfactory. My boy has Drift on Your Love as his ringtone, and he can sing it better than I can. My daughter's also a great singer. She guested on... My current band is called The Stores. We play original psychedelic rock, and my daughter's guested on our first album. and we're busy making our second album, so I hope that will be coming out this next year as well.
Many thanks indeed to Colin Stuart for speaking to me for this edition of Prague Talk, a podcast from Radio Prague International. If you're new to the pod and enjoyed listening to Colin, why not check out some of the earlier conversations in this series and subscribe wherever you get podcasts. But for now, that's all from me, Ian Willoughby. Thank you so much for listening to Prague Talk, and talk to you again very soon.